All right. Let me turn off the music. All right. So I think we are live now. Let me just cross check if I can see it on YouTube. All right, perfect. So again, welcome everyone. Welcome to yet another live stream around Couchbase and Hacktoberfest. We started this series back in September while we covered a lot of our AI integrations, and of course the month of October, since it's really special for Hacktoberfest, which means a lot of newcomers and experienced folks alike. They contribute to a number of different open source projects, and here at Couchbase as well, we have a number of different projects that you can actually contribute to. We have had previous streams where we covered things such as our starter kits, and then we have all of the Couchbase example projects and the Couchbase ecosystem projects that you can contribute to. We'll share the link of our designated blog post, which covers all the different kind of projects that you can contribute to. And today we are going to be speaking about Couchbase Shell, which is another way in which you can interact with your Couchbase clusters directly in the with the help of your shell or inside of your terminal. And of course, we have a special guest today with us today, who is Jack, who is based out of Manchester and is one of the primary authors for the project. So, Jack, would you want to probably give a quick introduction about yourself and what do you do at Couchbase?
Yep. Hi everyone. My name's Jack. So I'm a software engineer at Couchbase. I've been working on CB Shell probably 6-7 months now. It's a really cool project actually. A good way to get into Rust, which I know is very popular at the moment. It's the place where I learned. And yeah.
The point that you mentioned about Rust being really popular, I certainly agree to that. And by the way, again, one thing that we always like to say on repeat is that in case you are joining us new for the first time, we live stream this on LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, YouTube, and Twitch. So if you're joining in from anywhere, do say hi. We already see Matthew Groves, who has pretty much been on every single live stream that we have conducted. So huge shout out to Matthew Gross. He's also one of the superstars at Couchbase and building a lot of different integrations. But one thing that you mentioned, Jack, is that Rust is really popular these days. And in fact, I can probably say that for sure because I was part of a meetup that we conducted at our Bangalore office just a couple of days back on Saturday with the Rust Bangalore meetup group, where we actually got to speak about Couchbase Shell as an introductory session because we were co-organizing and co-hosting that particular meetup, and we had more than 65 people come, and we have a capacity of 60 people at the office. We have a common space where we conduct these meetups, and we had to put in extra chairs because it was completely filled, and every single person in the Rust community is super technical because, of course, given the fact that there is a learning curve involved whenever you go ahead and learn Rust. So in fact, like the talks that followed up our introductory session around Couchbase Shell were around things like how do you implement async uh, and async request inside of Rust. And there's such a deep dive conversation where the speaker had compared how it compares, how the async requests they compare in Golang, in Node.js, and Python. So it was very deep dive technical discussion around that, and then we had a few sessions around Tokyo library. So I think the Rust community is really technical in nature, and in fact, like I was completely blown away by just the overall technical level of conversations that we had. In fact, like we had a good mix of working professionals and students as well. So it's great that within our entire ecosystem we have at least a few open source projects that Rust developers can also collaborate and contribute to. And I know like Matthew is saying he should get an award. I think like he should definitely get an award because he's been there supporting us on each and every live stream. So thank you so much, Matthew, for taking out the time. But yeah, today's live stream, as I mentioned, is really important because, of course, it also shows that outside of our typical projects, which are primarily our SDKs, we have another project and a really versatile project which is written in Rust. And probably, Jack, like before we have a discussion around Couchbase Shell, would love to know about your own journey getting started with Rust, because despite the fact that yes, it is the most popular programming language, I feel that a lot of folks who want to get started with Rust might get intimidated because of the syntax, or how we know that Rust is probably a language that it will throw errors immediately even if there is a slight syntax issue. So in terms of just wrapping your head around the memory management in Rust, there are certain things that you as you start to work with Rust, it can be very at times it can be very frustrating as well, because it really helps you to write better code because of all of the type safety that's involved with Rust. So how did you get started with Rust, and what motivated you to then start working on a Rust project within Couchbase?
So I was just fortunate enough to the team that I moved into. They were kind of in charge of picking up Couchbase Shell. So I got the opportunity to learn through that. I think I started off all the material that's out there, like the Rust book is really good for explaining everything to you. It breaks it down into really nice steps. They're easy to learn. It's, as you say, it's definitely a bit of a learning curve. When you first start off, you're doing a lot of, it feels like you're fighting against the compiler a bit to try and get things up and running. But if you can get something to compile, it normally does what you want it to do. And although you will be looking through a lot of error messages, the error messages are really helpful. Like they tell you exactly what's wrong, exactly where the issue is. And I think CB Shell as well, it's not, there are lots of areas of it that aren't too complicated, so you can kind of dip your toes in, and it doesn't go straight in with like loads of asynchronous stuff that's going to be really complicated. You can kind of just work your way through the basic concepts, and I think it's definitely a kind of special way of thinking of with the whole borrow checker and ownership and everything that's pretty different to lots of other languages. But once you kind of wrap your head around that, it's quite easy. It's quite easy and friendly to use, and yeah, you're gonna make little mistakes, but they'll all get caught by the compiler. And I feel like I've spent a lot less time debugging things in this than I did in Golang, for example, because it just doesn't have the same safety stuff, and you can get things to compile there where it doesn't actually do what you want it to do, or it's just going to be running into panics or problems or things like that.
For sure. I think the Rust compiler is one thing that can really help you uh, write better code, because it's not just like detecting the errors, but it's also probably giving you suggestions on how you could perhaps remove or resolve those particular issues. So I think like it's one of the more advanced features that, at least as compared to compilers or interpreters in other languages, probably they might not be as detailed or descriptive as we have with the Rust compiler. So thanks for sharing those insights. But I think we can probably start, because our goal today is to actually not only showcase the project itself and give kind of a high level overview of how folks can actually get started with using Couchbase Shell, but it's also actually taking up an open source issue. And by the way, like we have more than 50 issues for the Couchbase Shell repository, and if anyone is interested in going ahead and making a contribution, feel free to actually go ahead and do that. And today we'll just show an example, a real world example of how you can set up the repository locally in your system and make contribution. So with that in mind, I'll probably quickly start to share my screen, and we can touch base about what is Couchbase Shell and how all of you can actually get started. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Just a minute. Okay. I think it should be visible. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that before we touch upon anything else, the first thing I wanted to cover is that Couchbase Shell is based on top of Nu Shell. So Nu Shell is another project that's one of the more dynamic types of shells that you can use in, and this is also actually written in Rust. Now, what makes it different than your typical shell is that you can actually create what we call as pipes. So pipes enable you to essentially put together multiple commands at the same time, and you can execute all of them at once. So in this example that you might probably see, we see the list command, but then we add some additional criteria or filtering to it, where we are seeing that we only want to see the list of files which have a size of more than 10 MB, and then we will sort them based on when they were last modified. So this kind of shows you that rather than having to write multiple commands one after another, you can essentially concatenate together multiple commands by using these pipes. And the Couchbase shell is essentially based on top of new shell. And if you already have had experience working with new shell and you understand the nitty gritties of how do you actually pipe together different kind of commands, then Couchbase shell would be something that would be very easy use. But the great thing about things like new shell is also that you can actually use it as your primary shell. So you can still use your existing commands like ls or vim, all of those typical commands that you might use in your terminal, those can still be used inside of new shell. So we will make sure to share the link of new shell with everyone. Let me go ahead and share this across. So essentially, a Couchbase shell is written on top of new shell, and again, a lot of the different capabilities, as Jake already mentioned that it's also written in Rust. So in fact, we do have an open source repository where we have shared the details on how you can actually get started with installing Couchbase Shell. So based on your operating system, you can just download the tar file or the zip file, and then go ahead and unzip it, and you should have the binary ready. And then you can always add it to your path based on the operating system that you are using. Now, also another great thing is that if you are just getting started with Couchbase Shell, so let me also go ahead and quickly share my entire screen for now. Uh, Let me just go ahead and do that. So once you have Couchbase Shell installed, you can very easily just go into Couchbase Shell, and if I open a new tab, so you can just type cbsh, which will take you to Couchbase Shell. And now we have officially entered the Couchbase Shell interface. And here you can type whatever type of commands you actually want to see. So, for example, right now, if I want to run this particular query, which is actually finding the inventory for the airlines based of the travel sample dataset, it will just run that. So, the idea over here is that when you set up Couchbase Shell for the first time, you create a config file where you add details such as your Capella or whatever type of Couchbase instance that you're connecting with. So in this case, it could be a Couchbase server, or if you're running it locally with Docker, or if you're connecting with Couchbase Capella. So in that case, you will have those details baked into your config. So in this case, this is an example of a config file where you can see that these are my cluster details, and of course I'll change them later on, but this kind of shows you that once you connect to this particular cluster, then you will be able to execute commands like things like your being able to look at your queries, and also then do a lot more advanced stuff, which right now Jake would actually show us. And if you want to also connect to your Couchbase cluster with the help of or to a Couchbase shell with the help of Capella. There is in fact a settings menu. So if you go to any of your dedicated databases, we have inside of the connect option, we have a dedicated Couchbase shell connect instructions as well. So here you can add your connection string, your password, and your username, and then you'll have to create a new file called as config and paste all of that as I showed you inside of my Couchbase shell config as well. And then once you have moved the config file to the .cbsh folder, then you can start by running some sample commands, which allows you to connect to your database cluster, and then run commands like being able to see all of uh, your buckets, scopes, and collections, and then also do things like being able to add or remove documents. And of course, we have dedicated documentation around Causeway Shell, which we'll make sure to also share with everyone. But I think like that's a fairly quick overview. But I would let Jack, probably, if you can share your screen, if you can probably give us a more in-depth overview of Causeway Shell. Also, I think you are on probably on mute. All right.
There we go. Can you see that?
Yes, we have started to share a screen.
Yeah, so one of the first things you're going to see is that Couchbase Shell has this custom prompt. So this is the username that I registered in my config file. So here's my config, for example. So I'm connected to this cluster called remote at the moment.
And do you mind like zooming in a bit in that config? This
Oh yeah.
perfect.
So what I've got as well is I've registered some Capella. So one of the nice things as well about CB Shell is you can have a separate config file and credentials file. So then you can put all your secrets like API keys, username, password in your credentials file, and then you can share this config file without having to worry about that. So I've got this cluster. Here's the connection string. This is the identifier that you can see up here. So at the moment I'm connected to it. If I have a look at, so using the buckets command, for example, so this allows me to perform bucket management operations. So if you just run buckets, it will list all of the buckets on the active cluster. So by active cluster, you can have more than one cluster at a time registered with the shell, and you can list them using the cbm managed command. So I've got two, one called local, one called remote. Remote one's running in Capella, the local one's just running on my machine. So the cbn commands, they're all to do with the execution environment of the shell. So for example, you have an active cluster, which is remote. There's also an active bucket, scope, and collection. So that just means where the commands are going to be run against. So for example, if you do a .get and your active bucket is default, then you're going to run that .get command against the default bucket. But at the moment, I don't think I have any buckets. So what I can do is I can load a sample bucket.
And is that because your current uh, selected Couchbase cluster is actually empty, that it does not have any buckets?
Yeah, there's nothing in it at the
Okay,
moment. It
got it.
is, I mean, I think I can show you it in the UI. Yep. So here's the actual cluster I'm connected to. So as you can see,
Yeah,
well, it had no buckets, but it's got a travel sample now because I just ran the command to load
you
it.
just run the command. Mhm.
So now if you run buckets again, you can see we've got a travel sample bucket. So then if I want to use that as my active bucket, then I can change to that like this. So then you can see that change has been reflected in the prompt. So now I'm going to be running up my commands against travel sample bucket. So for example, if I did a .get, and then so .get, you just give it the ID or the key of document, and it will get the contents of that document. So one of the nice things that we get from New Shell actually is that it has this really nice formatting because it understands kind of data structures. So JSON, for example, and it can format it nicely into a table like this. So the return you get is a table with a few columns. So one of them is ID, that's just the key of the document, and then the content is the actual body of the document. So not only can you get things, you can upload. So if you do any of these commands, you can do -h, which is the help flag, and then it shows you all of the sub commands. So you've got get, import, insert, remove, for example. As you mentioned before, we have our query command. So I'll go get one out the doc. Go get an example out the docs. So the query command just takes a nickel query as a string, but it also has support for positional parameters. So here we've given a positional parameter of country, and then we specify the value later as France. And then as you can see, we've got all our results from that. But one of the nice things you can do with this is if I run my query and if I limit it to a few results, then I think what I should be able to do is if I pipe that into a .get, for example. So what I've done here is I've got a list of IDs from my query, and then I piped
Yeah,
into my .get command, and then for each of those IDs, it's gone and fetched the contents of the document. Obviously, you could just do this by, instead of select Metro ID, just select all, but is just to kind of illustrate the example of how you can kind of build up more complex commands. So a good example of this is actually we've recently added support for vector search commands. And when you do a vector search, you just get back a list of IDs and the similarity score associated with that. So then what you can do
Yeah.
is you can do a vector search, pipe that into a .get or a sub.get, and then actually have a look at the contents of those documents that have been returned by the vector search.
Yeah.
So along with the buckets, you can do things like list all the scopes in a bucket. So there you go. So this scopes command will be run against the active bucket. So at the moment, this is the scopes in all of the these are the scopes in the travel sample bucket. But another nice things you can do is most commands have support for this clusters flag, and this takes a regular expression, and then what this will do is will run the command against any of the registered clusters that match this regular expression. So for example, before I showed I've got the local and the remote cluster. So as you can see, it's run the buckets command against my local cluster and my remote cluster. So on my remote one, I've just got travel sample, whereas on my local one, I've got my beer sample and my travel sample. So this is particularly useful if you want to do things like migrate between one cluster and another, because you can run the buckets command against one cluster, and then for all the buckets you have on a local cluster, for example, you could recreate these on a remote cluster and do the same thing with migrating query index definitions, which is quite nice. Or say you're kind of managing a whole mixed fleet, we've got a nodes command. So this lists all the nodes for the active cluster, for example. But you can do the same thing where you run that against all the clusters. So you could have a look
And
for. Sorry, what were you going to
and I
say?
guess like if you were to just probably so if you have like let's say three different databases right now, by just using the flag for clusters, you can specify which specific cluster you want to actually show it, whether it's your local one or the one that you have set up for Capella.
Yeah, of course. So if you've
Okay.
got like, if they're called like dev, stage, prod, you could just do it against two of them, or
Yeah.
kind of anything you can get to match this regular expression, you'll be able to do. So it kind of makes it pretty powerful in that way, because there's not many ways to so easily just manage a whole mixed fleet of clusters. I mean, through this you can create clusters, because we've got the clusters family of commands. So these work against Capella, so you can create cluster with clusters create, drop them, get them. So for example, if I just run the clusters command, so what this does is it lists all the Capella clusters in my active organization. So if I run my cbm command, you can see my active organization. Oh, I think it should show the project here somewhere. Ah, I need to use the Capella flag. Yeah, so you can see I'm in my hackathon project. So this just lists all of the clusters within that active project.
Yeah.
And you can change the active project with this cbm project command. And
And the one that you're showing right now, the one where you're seeing all of these different clusters. So these are part of your Capella, or are they part of your local system?
so this one is a remote cluster. So this is Capella
Yeah.
cluster.
Okay.
But I also have a local cluster registered, which is just running on my local machine. So if you have a look at, I think that's just running. It's just a classic Couchbase server cluster, and this is the one
Yeah.
with the beer sample and travel sample buckets on it.
Got it. Okay. And where is
Um,
the one that's the hackathon project? Is that part of the Capella or?
yeah, so that's here. It's
Okay.
running in our dev
Hmm.
environment. Um,
Okay. Got it.
yeah, and if you want any kind of to go through this in a bit more depth in our recipe section of the Couchbase Shell
Hmm.
docs, we have some stuff on managing multiple clusters that kind of walks through this, how you'd use it. It's quite a nice example here of, because when you run the nodes command, two of the things you get are the total memory and the free memory.
Hmm.
So I'll actually do that now. So before what we did, so you can't actually see it because we're too zoomed in. But if we get, I guess, memory free, is it? And then so then this is, so get or select. So this is the get and select are new shell commands that kind of for working with tables, if I
Gotcha.
can remember how to use them. So what this basically does is it chooses some of the columns by name. So for example, we could, it's probably more useful if you select the host name as well. So you can see what nodes you have, how much total memory they have, and how much free memory they have. And then from that, what you can do is you can, so if you copy this,
Some sort
so
of a
what
regex.
so what this command's doing, so it runs the nodes command against all of our clusters we've got registered, so we've got local and remote.
Yeah.
And then that pipes that into a new shell command each. And what that does is it just iterates over each row of a table. So each row of the table in this case represents a node. So each n, so n being a node. And then what we do is we add a new column to the table called utilization. And we're trying to calculate the percentage of memory that we're utilizing. So what we do is we get the total memory minus the free memory, and then we divide that by the total memory,
Memory. Okay.
and multiply it by 100. So that'll give our percentage free memory basically. And then what we're going to do is pipe that. So we do that for each of the nodes returned. And then
Okay.
after we've done that, we select cluster and utilization because we're just interested in what cluster we've got it from and the percentage utilization. And then finally, we've sorted by the utilization in reverse because we just want to see which ones have the most free. Say, for example, to be honest, probably more likely to sort the other direction to see which nodes are the most full because they might require some attention. But this is just quite a nice illustration of how you can kind of access these nested fields using new shell. So for example, this
Yeah.
syntax of $n, where this represents a node, and then you can just name the field. So it kind of works very well with a JSON database like ours, because you have lots of named fields and nested fields, for example.
Yeah. And I feel like if we were to write this logic through some code, I mean, it would probably take a lot more longer. So just the ease of use of being able to quickly fetch your nodes information, or being able to insert documents or update the documents, it's very quick to do that. In fact, like I think since we have a recipe around implementing simple rag, if you were to write our own Python logic for doing that, that might probably be like 50 100 lines of code logic, whereas here you can technically just run 3 4 commands and you'll have like a simple rag working for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of part of the beauty of it. It's supposed to kind of lower the bar for experimentation with these features, because quite
Yeah.
often it's Couchbase will come out with something cool and new, and you're like, that sounds really interesting, but obviously we're all quite busy. It's quite hard to find the time to, as you say, set up all the libraries, get all the dependencies in order. So hopefully Couchbase Shell should just make it easier to experiment with these things. And then if you have, obviously commands like this can get a bit long, but you can define your own custom commands. So you could just turn this into a whole new command, which could be like, call it utilization or something, and then you just have to type that to run it. Or
Yeah.
New Shell also supports scripts, so you can write a script in their language, which is new, and then you could just run that script as well.
Yeah.
So it is very versatile.
Absolutely. But I think having given a basic introduction, and I know like we have dedicated docs as well that folks can actually get started with. And in fact, like we had a really good Couchbase Shell blog posts which we released around last month, and I think Jack, you were one of the co-authors for that one. I'll just share that particular docs with everyone if everyone is keen to look at just kind of getting started, and of course, as you mentioned, the vector search capabilities which are now baked into the Couchbase Shell directly. And in fact, like we are also using Couchbase Shell within the Devrel team for our getting started guides. So all of the starter kits that we have right now, they run Couchbase Shell internally to be able to connect to your Capella instance, or if you are using a local Couchbase server instance. So when you go ahead and kick off the starter kit in either Gitpod or inside of GitHub code spaces, it automatically installs Couchbase Shell, and you can directly use Couchbase Shell over there. And we also use Couchbase Shell inside of our CI/CD pipelines. So there's a upcoming blog post as well from Laurent, who has gone through how you can incorporate Couchbase Shell inside of your GitHub actions. So it's really versatile because anywhere you have a shell, you can incorporate CB shell and you can run whatever different kind of commands that you want. So that, like, do you think it's a good time to probably segue into looking at one of the open issues and how we can contribute to Couchbase Shell?
Yeah, that sounds good. So
Yeah.
the one I was thinking of doing. So one of the commands that we added was a credentials create command. So that basically lets you create access credentials against a cluster, which is very handy when you're trying to connect to it with the shell, because you need to do that in order to use like doc operations and so on. So there was another issue that we recently opened. Let me find it. Yeah, so at the moment we support creating credentials, but it'd be nice to be able to list credentials as well. So what credentials you've created on a database, just to, maybe it's a sanity check after you've done a credentials create, you want to see that they've been created successfully or something like that. And it's quite good because it'll just kind of walk you through the structure of adding a new command, and then once you kind of understand that, it'll be very easy to kind of do more minor changes, I think.
And these credentials are basically the username and the password for a specific cluster, right?
Yeah, so if you look here, yeah, so it's these. So I suppose I'll show you the. So if you did credentials create, um, so yeah, so then you need the read and write flags. So say we wanted just read access for this one. So you run that, it'll ask you for a username. So just call it username, and then password. I'm not gonna be able to see it, but no, I didn't put enough security into my password, so I'll do that again.
Mhm.
Oh. So if I don't get timed out again, should be able to go back here.
This is like real time experimentation, which can always.
Yeah, there we
But
go.
this
So I've got
worked.
my
Yeah.
so create a new credential username, and then what I'll be able to do is then I can connect to the cluster using those credentials I just created. But one of the nice things is if you've defined a cluster in the config file, so you've already got a username and a password, there's a flag where you can use the username and password that you registered the cluster to the shell with, and you can use those to create credentials against the
Okay.
cluster, because it does this
And
through the
it's very
V4 API.
interesting that this one says that it is created by the shell key. So this is by default that whenever if you're creating a new cluster credentials via the Couchbase shell, it will always show the shell key. Or
No, so it'll show created by, and then this is the name of the API key that I use. So
okay,
most of the stuff against Capella is done through the V4 API,
yeah.
and so this is the name of the API key that I've got registered to in the
Mhm.
shell.
Yeah, and I think like one point that we can also create an issue right now live is that if you go to the Couchbase shell docs once, probably to the getting started page, the landing page, what you'll probably see over here is within the docs. If you look at the first example of how uh, how your config file would look like, if you can probably go to that section, So
yeah.
within the docs, it should be within the docs in the first probably few lines where we showcase. Yeah. So here you'll probably see that in the Capella organization we have access key and secret key, which I feel is probably from the V3 API, because for the V4 API it should be access key and the access secret, or not
Uh,
secret key, but something else. If I am not mistaken. So probably this might be something that we might want to upgrade.
yeah, yeah, that might be worth doing. Well, you can raise it as an issue, and then someone
Yeah,
watching the stream can hopefully pick it up.
yeah, yeah. But then we
Uh,
are having a question by someone who is asking. So Sedi is asking, when is Protostellar released? I have honestly no idea what is Protostellar.
I think I assume you mean that's Cloud Native Gateway, I believe. Um, so I think at the moment it's going through some performance testing, but I'm not sure when the actual scheduled release is. But
Okay,
soon, hopefully.
all right. So is that something that's related to the Couchbase Shell, or
Um, no, not really. The only reason I know about it is because I've done some work on it because it falls under the same team that manages Couchbase
oh,
Shell.
okay, got
So I've worked on it a bit, but it's not directly related to CB Shell.
got it.
Um, yeah. So shall I dive into? I might. How long have we got left on the stream? Because this issue might be too involved for the time we've got left.
So we have roughly 20 minutes left, so we can
Um,
at
yeah.
least
In that case, there's
give
a
a
bit
quick
more of a
overview. Hmm.
straightforward one. So basically, I've shown off the clusters command that lists all the clusters in your active project. So then there's also a clusters get command that you give the name of a cluster. Oh, clusters get. And then what this does is it returns the more detailed information about a cluster. Um, so while this is nice, it's actually missing some of the information that we get from the V4 API, which is the audit information. So if we have a look in here, so when you hit this endpoint, which is what the shell does, you actually get this audit data, which is created by, created at, so on and so forth, which would be quite handy to have because, say, for example, you want to list all the clusters in a project and see which ones you've created so that you can clean them up or something, or you might want to get rid of all the ones created before a certain date, so on and so
Yeah.
forth. So what I thought would be nice is I thought that we just didn't have support in CB Shell to do this, but it turns out we do, but it's actually just a bug that means that it's not getting printed. So the original ticket was to add a flag to the clusters get
Mhm.
command that prints out this audit data as part of this table. And we can still do that, but it'll just be a bit different than going from scratch. So I'll zoom in a bit on this. So a quick overview of the CB Shell project. The meat of it is all in this source, really, in the source file. So if you go into source and then CLI, there's a file for every command that we have. So the one that's of interest to us at the moment is clusters get. So here you can see this is defining the signature of it. So this is how you actually call the command. Here are all the flags associated with it. Um, so when I was preparing to do this thing, I was actually looking down through the command. So this is all kind of new shell stuff. So this run function is what gets run when you type the clusters get command into the shell.
Mhm.
So that calls this clusters get command. And then, so what this is doing is this name corresponds to the name that we pass in from the command line. So Oliver Rudolph Bayer in this case. So
Yeah.
this is just getting the argument at position 0. here we're getting a named flag, which is Capella, because you can specify the organization that you want to use. You can also specify the project, so on and so forth. So in here, what we're doing is we need to get the org ID and the project ID because of the structure of the Capella v4 API requests, because it's organization slash org ID slash project ID. And then once we've done that, so we use our client to actually get the cluster. So this is where we actually hit the v4 API. So we actually list all the clusters and then we match the one to the name that you've given and then return the information about that. So what I discovered when I was looking through here earlier is that we actually do already try and add the audit data, but for some reason nothing's getting added.
It's not.
So then when I was digging around, I discovered, so when we get the information from the v4 endpoint, we read it into this clusters response, which has a vector of clusters, and then each of these clusters looks like this. So this is quite a nice trait actually, because we're trying to unmarshal the JSON into this struct, but you use snake case in Rust. But then a lot of the time, everything is in camel case, but this just automatically converts all these snake case names to camel case. So basically, if there's something called current state, it's current, and then capital S state, that'll match up with this.
Okay.
So basically, the problem that I found was that while we are trying to read the audit data, we've basically just named the field wrong. Because as you can see here, it's just called audit. But here, we've called it audit data. So if we just change this name, and I think I'm gonna have to change it here.
So we are changing it from audit data to the camel case, or
No, we're just changing it to audit because I thought it was
okay.
called audit data, but it's just called audit.
Oh, okay.
So we are getting it from the API, but there's no field in the struct to read it into, so it's just kind of getting lost. So now that I've done that, and then if I run again,
And perhaps like it might also be good to kind of explain to the audience how do you actually build it and test it locally. So if someone is actually trying to contribute and they want to test out their changes first locally, how they can run like the local version, because they might have made some changes.
Yeah, so it's really easy. You can just clone the repo, and then you just need cargo installed, which is what's used to compile and run Rust code. So then what you can do with cargo is so there's cargo build and cargo run. So build will build a binary for you, and then cargo run just compiles it and then runs it for you. But that's only the case if you haven't made any mistakes. So this is what we're talking about with the Rust compiler. This is probably quite a good example. So there's no method named audit data. So that's probably because we just renamed the method that was called audit data to audit. So as you can see, here's the line where we're trying to use it. So we can just take that and go there from here. Okay, yep, so just need to change that to audit. And then we can try and run it again with cargo run.
Right.
And this should just start it. It's looking better this time. Okay, so now if we do clusters get. Okay, nice. So now you can see we've got this newly added audit data created created by, got an ID, created at, modified by, modified at. So since the original ticket was to add a flag to allow us to display this if we want, then we may as well do that as well, because you'll get a bit more of an idea about how all these things work. So here's the signature of a command, as I said. So you require the name, and you've got named flags here, so compiler and project. So for example, you can kind of see this if you do clusters get and then help. So this is just the help for the clusters get command. So as you can see from the
Yeah.
flags here, you've got compiler and project. So that's because we've
Hmm.
defined them here. So what we want to do is we want to add a new flag, but this one's not going to be named because it's just true or false. So then there's a special type of flag you can use for that, which is a switch flag. So basically, if it's there, then it evaluates to true. If it's not there, then it evaluates to false.
Yeah.
So the name of this flag is audit. What else we need to do in here? So the description would be return audit data about cluster, and then I think the final field is what you want the short to be. So we could just put an A or something if you wanted this to be, and then you
Like an
could use
alias for.
yeah. So for example, you see here to get the help, you can either do a double dash and type the word help, or a single dash and just do H. So
Yeah.
if you put A here, for example, you could either do double dash audit, or you could just do a single dash and then an A. Um, so it's quite handy if you've got like the same flag again on most commands, and you just want to
Hmm.
kind of make it easier for people to use. But this is actually one of the nice things um, about Rust was these kind of optional values, um, because basically it can either be none or you'd say some and then A, for example here. But it's just nice because, for example, while in Golang, you'd have to if a value hasn't been set, you just use the zero value, right? So if it's an int, then
Yeah.
it's zero. If it's a string, it's an empty string. Whereas in Rust, you have this option type, so you can specifically say this can be something or it cannot be something. But then you know that if it's not something, then it should just be none. It's not going to be
Hmm.
because there can be a lot of confusion in Go whether like has this been set and it's just been set to zero, or was it never set at all, and that can that's led to some issues in the past. So now we've added this audit flag. What we need to do is actually go and check if it's there. So in a similar way to here where we read the name flag, what we can do is say let audit equal cool dot has flag, and then so the name of the flag, so engine state. So I think it's
So in this
engine
case,
state.
do you think like will we also probably need to have like the execution logic where we'll check the flag and only include the audit data if it has been set? So like we can say that we when we are executing the command, we'll have cluster dot audit, and then we will see whether we have that flag actually present to showcase the information.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't know, you might not always want to show it as kind of something that's a bit more fine grained and specialized, or
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, since the clusters get commands already for getting all the information about a cluster, we'll
Yeah.
probably end up just leaving it out. But for the purposes of this demo, it's quite nice to see how you
Hmm.
can add new flags and kind of start figuring out how it
Yeah.
works. So now we've got this bool that should represent whether or not the audit flag has been passed in. And then we can go down to this section where we print out the audit data. Um, so again, you see this sum keyword that I was talking about before of um, in relation to optional values. So it's
Hmm.
because our clusters, it's because the audit field on our cluster is an option. So what this is basically doing, it's unwrapping the optional value. So you're basically saying that if this audit field has been set, then do this stuff. If not, then don't. But this is just kind of the idiomatic way of doing it.
Yeah.
So what we can do is we can say if audit, then if it's been set, we will add it to our output. So then what we can do is exit, so that just quits the shell. We can run it again with cargo run. Um, And I know this is all been a bit quick, but if you are looking through the issues and you've got any questions, anything, please feel free to drop a comment. I'm happy to answer anything or like help walk you through things if anything's unclear.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, like feel free to also join our Discord server, so that if you have any questions related to not just the Couchbase Shell project, but any other open source projects from Couchbase, we have team members over there, so they'll be able to help you.
Yeah. Um, so I've just done clusters get help just to kind of see that the flag has been registered correctly. So as you can see,
Yeah,
we have a new audit flag, so return audit data about the cluster. So if we do our clusters get command from before, so it shouldn't have the audit data on it now. Yep, so it's just how it was
yeah, it
before.
doesn't.
Whereas now, if we add audit, there we go. Now it's got
Perfect.
our audit
Mm.
data
Yeah,
there. Yeah. So
that is
then,
perfect.
obviously, once you've done that, you can just raise a pull request. We do have inbuilt unit testing that gets run automatically as part of a PR, so don't have to worry too much if you break anything. As I said before, that's one of the nice things about the Rust compiler. Normally, if you have broken something, you're going to know at compile time. You won't be able to sneak any bugs in, hopefully. But yeah,
Yeah, makes sense. I know we are probably running a bit out of time, but I think like this was a really great demonstration, and thank you so much, Jack, for providing us kind of key insights on how one can actually get started with Couchbase Shell. Probably in the last, what we can also showcase is that I wanted to quickly touch upon our quick start guides that we have, so our starter kits, and how you can see the usage of Couchbase Shell over there. So if you don't mind, I can quickly just share my screen. So let me go ahead and do that. So for those who are new, we have a bunch of starter kits which are meant for anyone to quickly get started with using Couchbase. So we'll provide some sample code with sample configuration, environment setup, so that you can just fill in your environment or your cluster details, and you'll have very simple to get started with the application. So for example, we have one for the Spring, and here what you'll see is that inside of our GitHub Actions, when we are running these workloads, we're actually adding CV shell, and that's what is actually then running the actual test for you. So we are providing CV shell capability, and you can actually get started with using these starter kits directly with the help of either GitHub Code Spaces or Gitpod, and you just have to click on this, and we have scripts with our dev container or our Gitpod YAML that will automatically take care of installing all of the necessary dependencies related to the code and automatically run the code for you. The only thing that you'll do will require for you to do is that if you want to connect to a remote cluster, then you can just edit those details. Otherwise, it automatically runs a Docker container with a simple single node cluster that's running Couchbase server that will run inside of your GitHub code space or your Gitpod environment. So that's another use case where you can use CV Shell with your CI/CD. You can use it as part of your local cluster, or perhaps if you're running some workshops, then you can again add it so that it's easy for you to be able to maneuver and then test out or experiment with your cluster, as Jack mentioned. So thank you so much, Jack. Like that was really helpful and useful information. But I know like we are probably a bit over time. If you wanted to probably add anything else to this, again we will share the link of the Couchbase Shell with everyone. We really welcome uh, contributions to Couchbase Shell, and of course all the list of other different repositories that we have as part of the Hacktoberfest. And we'll really welcome any other contributions that folks are interested in.
yeah. One quick thing on that is that we've highlighted some issues on the repo, so there's a label that's good first issues. So if you're looking for somewhere to start, then feel free to pick up one of them. Or,
Yeah.
as I say, if there's just another thing that seems interesting, Um, please feel free to get stuck in, ask any questions. We're happy to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think with that we can probably conclude. Again, thank you so much, Jack, and for sharing and coming up on such a short notice and kind of exploring how we can get started with Couchbase Shell and how one can actually make contributions as well. So we should probably hang out again sometime, perhaps to discuss more about Rust internals, because I know that Rust is such a popular language these days, and we should probably have a separate series altogether around Rust and how one can, like talking more about like the anti patterns in Rust and how not to learn Rust probably. So we should definitely have some discussions around that.
Yeah, we've got some at the moment. We're working on some streaming stuff that's got some more async um, implications, so that kind of gets
Yeah.
more into the meat of it. So yeah, once that's
Hmm.
all done, it'd be nice to have a chat about it.
Absolutely. All right. With that, we'll probably conclude the entire live stream. Again, thank you everyone who joined us, and of course, the live stream links will be there available on YouTube. So if you have missed out this particular stream, feel free to always go back to our list of live streams that we have conducted previously on our Twitch and on our YouTube, and you'll be able to explore all of the list of other live streams that we have had for Hacktoberfest and our AI integrations as well. Again, thank you very much.